Blood and cold stone, rust bleaching to a scurf of crystal, stain on the jail yard paving we cannot lift. Crash of the volley and our hope. When they carried out your stretcher, the yard darkened to a well of shame, and steadily it grows darker. This is the shrine our rulers keep, and today they have graced it with flowers. Let us grant them at least their honesty, their naked love of presence.
As long as I live, I will have no rest. Only working. Only working. As long as I live, I will have no rest. Only working, educating, and organizing and fighting to destroy the forces that produce poverty.
Well, I remember my very first kind of interaction with kind of the whole 1916 rising and things like that. And I was in school. I was only in like late primary school, and what always kind of struck me about Connolly was the kind of the violence of his particular death. It really kind of struck me that this man was strapped to a chair, and he was just basically cut down in a very, very vicious way. And I always wondered, like, for what reason would they do that to a man who was already on his way out, so to speak? He kind of understood then that there was a lot more to the man than just an army soldier. He was a leader. He was a person that was able to galvanise people, to raise people up. And from a very young age, I realised that that's why they went after Connolly in the way that they did.
So when I was 17, growing up in Cork, I read Connolly for the first time. And the first publication that I read was Labour in Irish History. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that it changed my life, because Connolly's writings introduced me to class politics, to class analysis, but also the idea of the one big union, general unionism, the idea of organising workers as a class regardless of their grade or profession or occupation, and the power of that, bringing everybody together in one union, bringing men and women and people of different ages and ethnicities together was hugely formative for me, and of course so influenced by his strident feminism, and I suppose the humanity of his writing.
July 3rd, 1894. To Care Hardy. Perhaps they will learn how foolish it is to denounce tyranny in Ireland, and then vote for tyrants and instruments of tyranny at their own door. Perhaps they will see that the landlord who grinds his peasants on a Connemara estate, and the landlord who rack rents them in a Cowgate slum, are brethren in fact and deed. Perhaps they will realise that the Irish worker who starves in an Irish cabin and the Scots worker who is poisoned in an Edinburgh garret are brothers with one hope and destiny.
Both of his parents were really famine emigrants post Great Hunger. They left Monaghan and made a new life in Edinburgh. There would have been talk at home about the terror that was visited on the people by Westminster Parliament. There was plenty of food in Ireland, and yet 1.5 million people starved to death. So I often think that James Connolly's early life conversations in his house would have been peppered with discussions about the Great Hunger.
The emigration, the poverty, the destitution and the dispossession, they were all combining to hit the lowest orders in society. But he grew up in a small area. It was kind of considered a little Irish slum, in fact, in Edinburgh, the Cowgate. And the family would have been very Irish, and it was a very Irish community. Went to an Irish Catholic school locally, and they would have been very, very familiar with poverty and unemployment. So from an early age, Connolly would have been exposed to hardship, unemployment, and in fact he had to leave school at the age of 10.
I and all the week ye bide your lane. I and all the week ye are waiting for the minute that he's coming home. Oh, you can fit why he has to work, and you can the yours he has to keep. Aye, and yet it makes ye angry when you see him just come home to sleep. Aye, all the week your man's a war. Aye, and all the week ye bide your lane. Aye, and all the week you're waiting for the minute that he's coming home. Oh, you can fit why he has to work, and you can the yours he has to keep. Aye, and yet it makes ye angry when you see him just come home to sleep.
Everything about our lives, just like everything about our society, has been commodified and broken down into chunks. So in the old industrial revolution, the bosses controlled your time when you were at work. But now the system controls the way we use our time 24 hours a day. And, you know, it's increasingly expensive to, if you're lucky enough to even have a home, a roof over your head, whether it's rent or mortgage you're paying. People have to work very long hours. And that standard of living comes at a cost to your time. And I can't speak for everybody, of course, I'm kind of only speaking for myself, but, we are literally being caught up in a rat race. And I think it's very hard for people to feel that they have much agency over their lives. And that has to have a knock-on effect on our understanding of the world, our understanding of ourselves and each other, our understanding of what a community is, of what sort of solidarity means in a world of 8 billion people, where 3.5 billion people are living below the poverty line. And this should be a major cause for concern, but it is difficult to explain to people when the dominant view coming across in the media is that, wealth is a good thing, basically, and more of it the better.
It was one of the first socialists that I read. I remember when I was about 15 years old, getting collection of Connolly's works off my dad's bookshelf and reading that very closely. And he presented the problems that existed in Ireland at the time and that continue to exist in Ireland today very clearly, which is that the majority of people in our society are dependent on employment from employers, and those employers control the means of production, and that creates a very large imbalance in power and wealth and income in our society, and this is a whole series of knock-on effects. If you look at in Ireland today, the top 10% own about 50% of the wealth in the country, while the bottom 50% own less than 10% of the wealth in this country.
When he was 14 years of age, he falsified his name, falsified his age as well, and joined up with the King's Liverpool Regiment. And as he said later on in life, I joined for the want of something to eat. When he joined up, it was 1882, so he ended up being stationed in Ireland, and he signed up for 7 years. But his period in the British Army in Ireland, it wouldn't have been like your normal British soldier who might have spent the weekend drinking, going around Monto in Dublin, the red light district. Connolly was teetotal, didn't like to drink, didn't like to smoke, and it would appear he probably spent most of his money buying books and educating himself as well.
Ireland, as distinct from our people, is nothing to me. And the man who's bubbling over with enthusiasm for Ireland and yet can pass unmoved through the streets and witness all the wrong and suffering and shame and degradation brought upon the people of Ireland. Aye, brought by Irishmen upon Irishmen and women, without burning to end it, is in my opinion a fraud and a liar in his heart. No matter how much he loves that combination of chemical elements he is pleased to call Ireland.
It's very clear that housing conditions of working people in Dublin and Belfast were extremely important to the struggles that they were fighting before the foundation of the state. Belfast and Dublin had amongst the worst in Europe in terms of the quality of the housing, and those were huge areas of conflict. I don't think you can understand either the lockout or the trade union involvement in the Rising without understanding the appalling housing conditions that existed in urban Ireland at the time.
Dublin was the poorest capital city on these islands. The average male wage earner in Dublin would be earning somewhere between 15 shillings and 20 shillings a week. In some occupations, it might be higher, but the money was spent on essentials, and tea was a big item, bread. So life was a constant struggle, and it was almost impossible to live on on 18 shillings or 20 shillings a week. There were more domestic servants in Dublin than there were industrial workers. A lot of them country girls. One of them was actually the woman who became James Connolly's wife, Lilie. They famously met near Beggars Bush Barracks, both running for a tram.
Dear Lilie, this is a love letter. This is a letter written by me, Jim, to the nicest girl between here and anywhere on, to tell her that all her mistakes, her willfulness, troublesomeness, only make me love her the more, and make me more than ever determined to have the possession of a delightful bundle of contradictions all to myself.
There was no doubt that they were really very, very united, and they were very loyal to each other. And I think Lilie was a stalwart that he could count on throughout his life, right up to his death. And so she suffered, and in a way, she epitomises something that we're only becoming aware of, is the role of women. And the women played all through those struggles, and that the women had to carry the domestic pressures of the time, which were huge.
Well, my dad was his firstborn grandchild, and my grandmother always talked about his emphasis on reading as they grew up as children. Forever talking about reading and reading stories to them and asking them about the story he would just have read to them. And her memory was forever moving from place to place with trunks and trunks of books. But it was difficult to raise the topic of James Connolly with my grandmother because she would inevitably break down. When she was writing her memoirs, she was living with us in Ballymun at the time, and when she was writing her memoirs, you could hear her weeping as she wrote them in my sister's bedroom.
He learned, incidentally, he learned Italian so that he could read Italian. And I understand he understood German and French as well. So he had accumulated knowledge so that he could read internationally and understand the philosophers and the pioneers of socialism in other parts of the world. So essentially, he was an internationalist with a very strong national vision.
Years ago, I saw that the English conquest consists of two parts: the conquest of our liberties and the conquest of our land. I saw clearly that the reconquest of our liberties would be incomplete and worthless without the reconquest of our land. Mark the words of this prophecy. The principles I propose go to the very foundation of European society, and sooner or later will cause Europe to uprise. Mankind will yet take possession of its heritage.
Connolly went to Dundee first, and Lilie stayed in Ireland.
Dear Lil, for the first time in my life, I feel extremely diffident about writing a letter. Usually I feel a sneaking sort of confidence in the possession of what I know to be a pretty firm grasp of the English language for me in my position. But for once, I'm at a loss. I wish to thank you for your kindness to me.
I'd say he developed his socialism when he joined his brother John in Dundee, and one of the most influential people on Connolly was a man in Scotland called John Leslie, and Leslie introduced him around the place to the various members of the various Scottish socialist organisations. In fact, Connolly ended up being blacklisted for all the agitation that he was involved in, and it was John Leslie who made an appeal in a socialist magazine called Justice. Is there anybody who has work for James Connolly? Well, the only people who answered the advert in Justice by John Leslie were a group known as the Dublin Socialist Club. And the first thing he did was disband that small club, and he refounded a new one, the Irish Socialist Republican Party. His whole life changed from then on.
it was mainly a talking shop. They'd sell their newspaper, they'd hold rallies. They would support things like, the protests against royal visits and so on. That's how James Connolly would have met people like Arthur Griffith and Maud Gonne.
Connolly had a coffin painted up in black and in white the words British Empire. And they marched through the city centre. And when they got to O'Connell Bridge, the police intervened and there was a bit of a scuffle. And Connolly grabbed the coffin himself and gave it a good shove into the River Liffey. And he shouted, "To hell with the British Empire." And the police, of course, arrested him and he was sent to jail for one night. And Maud Gonne, in fairness to her, posted bail.
The day will come, and perhaps like a bolt from the blue, when the frontiers drawn around the countries of the world will not be sufficient to prevent the hand clasp of friendship between the peoples. But that day will only come. But that day will only come when the kings and kaisers, queens and czars, financiers and capitalists, who now oppress humanity, will be hurled from the place of power. And the emancipated workers of the earth, no longer the blind instruments of rich men's greed, will found a new society, a new civilization, whose cornerstone will be labour, whose inspiring principle will be justice, whose limits humanity alone can bound. Free, free! Free, free!
I find that I have a lot of experience with queer activism and what it looks like today, and so much of it is explicitly socialist, so much of it is explicitly rooted around building up workers and shared liberation, because of that, someone always comes to our trans pride protests with a placard that it's Connolly's face, and then on the back of it is the trans flag, which is an interesting co-option, but it's true. He's sort of a figure that is everywhere, whether you're aware of it or not. If you go to a protest, if you go to a public meeting, he's kind of the hidden voice in every room.
Even though we're only aware of climate change in the sense that we're aware of it now, from the 1970s probably, I think in socialist writings at the time, there was an awareness that the type of capitalism that pervaded the extractivism that went on was damaging to climate and to our environment and the earth as well. We could have made a society where we didn't leave anybody behind. We have enough resources. We're one of the richest countries in the world. We could spread it out in a different way where nobody's lives would be terrible. And it wouldn't be that hard to do that. That's the really sad thing about it, is that we've done so well in some respects and then just failed at the hurdle of sharing it more equally. But it's that idea that, evil men prosper when good people are silent. I think that's so true. And it's really important at the moment not to be silent and and that's why it's important to talk about hope, to give people hope and to give them the incentive to not be quiet and scared when they see what's happening in the world, but to take a side.
The reality is that if we don't act on these things now, some of the impacts of climate change become absolutely irreversible and unavoidable. But unfortunately, that's quite difficult to mobilise people around.
I think it's always hard to conceive how the man continued to write, to campaign, and to be so passionate about political change, faced with trying to rear a family and in the poverty that they were in. And the jobs he got, before he worked for the trade union, before that, there were part-time jobs where you get a few bob, and you weren't sure you'd get it any week, from the Socialist Party or the Socialist Republican Party. And it tended to depend on producing little pamphlets that they would maybe sell and get small amounts of money. But there was nothing that gave a regular income.
He led a very full life. Political thinker, political activist, political leader.
historian, journalist, union activist, union organizer, union leader, as well as signature to the proclamation in 1916 leader. So I think it's very important that we recast Connolly and see him in a different light. I mean, I give you an example. I worked in Belfast for 6 years. If you walk down the Shankill Road and you ask people, what do you know of James Connolly? If they knew him, they'd say, oh, he was a provo. You know, so the historical irony of that. And again, his republicanism was a part of who he was, but it wasn't all of what he was.
The fact that a fellow who had no formal education ended up producing books must have been a proud moment for him. And of course, this attracted the attention of a man called Daniel de Leon over in the United States. Dan de Leon was the effective head of American socialism. And he invited Connolly on a lecture tour of the United States in 1902. So Connolly saw a great opportunity here to maybe sell subscriptions to his newspaper, the Workers' Republic, and off he went.
There was a huge involvement of Irish workers in America in the growing trade unions. And this, again, the residual from the famine and the families of the migrant people in America. And there was certainly, at that stage, you can imagine, the idea of what kind of America was going to emerge. It was the land of the free. People hoped that they were recreating a whole new society. And there was a bubbling enthusiasm for new ideas.
The New York Times reported on his arrival. Agitator Connolly is here. So he made the news, and he spoke in a place called Cooper Union, which is very famous in the United States for hosting great lecturers over the years. Lincoln spoke at the very podium that James Connolly would speak at later on. And again, the newspapers reported on the great welcome that this Irish representative of Labour had. Hats were thrown in the air cheering him, and he went off on a long lecture tour all around the USA.
We cannot close our eyes to what is happening to any fellow worker, no matter where he comes from or nor what the colour of his skin may be. We are all members of the working class.
He then decided the best thing for him to do to help feed his family was to emigrate to the US.
I had heard about Connolly and Larkin in my home growing up from a young age, but the first time I actually explored both Connolly and Larkin, but Connolly in particular at that stage, was in 1993. I was 16 and had been out of school for a year and a bit and a bit aimless. And I remember reading a story about him being in New York, speaking to a room full of Italian workers. I think it might have been actually a rally. And he started to speak Italian to these workers. The idea of him having very little education but going on to do so much and being this working class person who refused to have any barriers in his way, I found this endlessly impressive at the time. I just thought that was incredible.
Oh, you can't scare me. I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union. Oh, you can't scare me. I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union till the day I die. There once was a union maid. She never was afraid of the goons and the ginks and the company finks and the deputy sheriff who made the raid. She went to Union Hall where a meeting it was called. When the company boys came around, she always stood her ground. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the union. Sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the union. Sticking to the union till the day I die. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the union. Till the day I die.
A terrible tragedy happened, though, on the very day that the family were due to set sail for America to join their dad, when the eldest daughter, Mona, who was only 14 years of age at the time, was in a friend's house on the other side of the city, on the north side, and she was with her younger sister, Ina. And Mona was a very busy young lady, and she wanted to help out by doing some washing for the lady. And she lifted a huge pot of boiling water up onto the stove, and her little apron got caught and went on fire. And she ran outside and turned on a tap in the back, trying to brush the flames away. But the poor kid, she died the next day from her horrific burns. Now think about this: a week later, the family joined Connolly. They sailed all the way over there, and it would appear that they weren't even able to make it to the funeral, that they had to go. If they had lost out on the fare to America, they wouldn't have been able to join their dad at all. And he would have had to go down to Ellis Island on a daily basis, have the Connolly family come in. Have you got Lilie and her children? So poor Connolly was informed by one of the officers there that his daughter had died, and he said himself it was the blackest period of his life.
Troy, 29 September 1904. Dear Mulray, excuse my neglect in writing to you. You must have read of the loss of my eldest daughter, and you can understand I was in no humour of writing. Mrs. Connolly informs me that the socialists in Dublin showed great sympathy to her in her last great trouble. I am thankful for them, for that proof of kindness, and also as a token that old-time relations were not entirely blotted out.
Things like trade unions were the places that brought people together. And the IWW, it's interesting that the title is the International Workers of the World, not of America. So their idea was to embrace all races and all nationalities. And Connolly became employed at one stage with the IWW, and he was concentrating on Irish migrant workers, and he lived in Troy. The Wobblies were the international workers of the world. And they sprung up among, you could have called them hobo labourers. And incidentally, they had a big effect on the thinking of the American trade union movement. And in time, on Connolly and Larkin in Ireland, they developed the idea of the one big union. So there were short periods where they did have, a period where he had at least a wage coming in on a regular basis. But it wasn't consistent. It would have been up and down.
There's lovely stories of him that Elizabeth Gorley Flynn tells about him having a tea party with the little kids on the road when he lived in America. You know, this is someone who was a giant of the workers' movement, but would take time out to spend with little children, who rushed out a letter in support of suffragettes who were imprisoned for breaking windows, And he started a letter saying, I'm so sorry for not doing this sooner. It would have been enjoyable to do it then, but it's urgent now to write and support you. So Connolly, I think, was an incredible human being, and someone who wanted to see everyone rise together against oppression and greed.
May 1908. Our great American institution today is the breadline. Every night in New York, thousands of men and women stand in line in the public streets, waiting for their turn to receive a few crusts of bread to keep mind and body and soul together. The same in every other city or town from east to west. The breadline is the great American institution, but I do not think I would shoulder a rifle in defense of it.
I was introduced by actually an uncle of mine when I lived in the States to the writings of Connolly, and he was a big fan of Connolly. He had only ever gone to secondary school himself, but when he immigrated in the 50s, mid-50s, one of the books he took with him was the writings of Connolly, and he often referenced them. And this was long before my involvement in the trade union movement. And I have that book, I still have that book, and I trained as a nurse in Dublin, and then I immigrated and worked abroad, worked in America for a while. And I returned to work in Ireland about 93, and I saw that there was clearly no autonomy really given to the clinical voice. And the only avenue that was available to us at that time as working nurses was through our union. And that led to the first ever national nurses strike in 1999. And it was really a groundswell of my peers at the time, staff nurses, saying, this is not right. We have qualified, we've trained, we've had postgraduate training, and we have a lot to say about how the health services should be run. And that started my journey into trade unionism.
There's a wonderful article that he wrote, and he says, is socialism simply the state taking control over things? And he says, no, it's not. He says, socialism is about workers taking control over the machinery and the tools necessary to run the economy. And he says that moving things from private to public ownership only moves us in the direction of socialism, insofar as ordinary people increase their ownership over government and over the way our society is run. And I think that's a very distinct idea, very Republican idea about the nature of socialism and about the nature of what's necessary to move towards a just and equal society.
Life in the US was good for the family for a few years, and his wife Lilie said every time they seemed to just get a few sticks of furniture together and get a place, that they had to move again. And in 1910, with much correspondence between himself and Dublin, a lecture tour was offered. And he wrote to Bill O'Brien saying, I'm kind of excited to get back home, because he missed Ireland very badly. And of course, when he got back here, things had changed a little bit. Jim Larkin had founded a union the year before, the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, and the first person Connolly went to visit was Larkin.
Connolly did have quite a reputation, and a deserved reputation, as a speaker and lecturer. So he came back to Ireland, addressed a number of meetings, but inevitably the meetings ran out. The subscriptions to attend the meetings ran out. He was going to have to go back to his family in America. When O'Brien approached Larkin about taking him on as one of his new organisers, Larkin agreed. So Connolly was able to stay and bring the family back.
He wrote the inevitable letter to Lilie to tell her, listen, pack up your bags, come on home. This time, of course, she would be quite insistent, as he was as well, that they were not to go back to the slums. They got a place down in Ringsend in Dublin, but in 1911, the whole family moved up to Belfast.
A lot of my work is in Northern Ireland, and I'm very conscious that there's narratives and counter-narratives about James Connolly, but if you're very concretely and specifically focused on the issues facing the working class, it's absolutely the case that Connolly and Larkin, particularly in their time in Northern Ireland, would have done enormous work in uniting Catholic and Protestant workers on the issues that affected them at work with their bosses, and did so to hugely inspirational effect.
We hear in the United Nations now in the Sustainable Development Goals the expression "leave no one behind," but I think that was rooted in Connolly's understanding of the world to bring the world from the perspective of the weakest and the most vulnerable. And he saw gender in that, but he also was, I suppose, intersectional in his thinking. He saw the connections across different types of inequalities and what needed to happen there. And I think that's really important at the moment, that idea of, like, what Connolly had it in spades was a sociological imagination, I would call it, but people would often call it a political imagination or institutional imagination, just trying to imagine that, yes, it is possible for the world to be organised in a different way, to a different set of values, and achieving different type of outcomes.
The worker is a slave of the capitalist society, and the female worker is the slave of that slave. In Ireland, the female worker has hitherto exhibited in her martyrdom an almost damnable patience.
I would imagine that Connolly's feminism was propelled by the great women that were around him, like Winifred Carney, women like Helena Maloney, women like Countess Markovich, the women that he organised with in Belfast. So I would imagine influenced by women in his life and seeing those women, but also he's influenced by feminist theory and by witnessing the politics and the trade unionism and the activism and the revolutionary fervour.
In 1911, Connolly was in Belfast, and he had played an incredible role organising a number of strikes of dock workers. He set up a workers' marching band made up of workers from Catholic and Protestant backgrounds, bringing those traditions together. On the back of the work that he had done with the dock workers, probably exclusively men at that stage, he was contacted by young mill workers. Many of them had fathers, brothers, friends who would have been male dockers who had worked with Connolly. And he was contacted by these, they were girls, they were young girls. They weren't allowed to do their hair in work. They weren't allowed to bring in sweets. And they weren't allowed sing, and a whole list of other, nonsense stuff, trying to keep them in their place in order to speed up production. Ultimately, there was a walkout, and they contacted Connolly, much to the annoyance of more conservative union leaders at the time. Connolly intervened. He organised a meeting of 1,500, mostly young girls, turned up to this meeting. And he said, well, if we're fighting them on this, we'll put in a pay claim as well, which makes sense, obviously. It was quite a hard battle. They didn't win on the pay, but when they went back in singing.
As we go marching, marching in the beauty of the day, 1,000,000 darkened kitchens, 1,000 mill lofts grey are touched with all the radiance that a sudden sun discloses. For the people hear us singing, bread and roses, bread and roses. As we go marching, marching, we bring the greater days. For the rising of the women means the rising of the race. No more the druid idler, tender toll where one reposes, but the sharing of life's glories, bread and roses, bread and roses.
People like James Connolly would never have been able to come back to Ireland and work as full-time trade union workers and socialists if they hadn't been given a job by Jim Lorcan. Well, his parents, funny enough, also came from the border counties. They came from South Armagh and they emigrated to Liverpool. And he became part of the Labour movement. But again, he had that deep sense of Irish identity.
Our house was kind of a Larkinite house. My mother and father, they always talked about Larkin. I've often been asked even about religion. I think our religion was Larkinism. Because they had they both came from very poor working class families in the city of Dublin. And of course, Larkin to them was the Messiah, the man who came along and stirred the embers of the society. I was just thinking, my mother used to sing a little song. My mother played around Liberty Hall as a kid. They lived in Mulber Street as well, and they were from Liberty. They used to sing a little song, come on and join. Come on and join, come on and join. Come and join Jim Larkin's Union, where you get your tea and sugar free and a belt of a baton from the DMP. Come on and join, come on and join. Come on and join Jim Larkin's Union. You can march all day up and down the quay, but you'll still get home to your mammy for your tea. Come and join, come and join, come and join Jim Larkin's Union.
You cannot build a free nation on the basis of slavery. We are against the domination of nation over nation, class over class, sex over sex. But if we are to make Ireland the Ireland of our dreams and aspirations, we must have a free and self-respecting and independent people. You can never have freedom or self-respect whilst you have starvation. Whether it's under the green flag or the Union Jack that's flying overhead. If there is nothing in your stomach, it matters mightily little what flag is flying.
I think for a lot of people, housing conditions are an awful lot better. The quality of most people's homes is hugely better, and we still have a sort of a legacy from a successful period, high home ownership and so on. But there's a significant proportion of the population who are living in very poor homes, and then overcrowding and homelessness, very high rents for an awful lot of people. So there's a very significant proportion of our population that is living in conditions which are, comparable with some of the conditions that were prevailed 100 years ago.
I think he was a very empathetic man, and I think you'd look around and he'd be really saddened by what's happening, really hurt by it, even at the statue over across the road, every morning coming to work, there's a homeless man sleeping at the statue, Man's really sad. But, would he look at the last, 100 years as being progress from where we were? Connolly was born into, abject poverty, in Edinburgh. Do we have that now? Maybe not, but we still have 4,000 homeless children in Ireland. I think he'd be saddened by it.
What Connolly would be showing us, or what we would learn from his way of approaching, is to say that we aren't going to solve the homeless crisis unless we solve the housing crisis, so that we've actually a common, the people who are most marginalised have a common interest with people who are really just having a hard time, or people who are not having a hard time themselves but whose children are having a hard time, and to build on that commonality of interest against those people who don't share that interest, rather than breaking it up into fragments of grievance, to pull that together to make sense of where that genuine grievance is coming from and how it can be resolved.
I've seen people in the course of a struggle or a strike be transformed. They're one person at the start of a dispute, and by the end, particularly when we win, they've had their heads lifted. We need to be able to make lines of arguments that actually a united, organised working class can actually face down, globally even, can face down the threat of war, of repression, of division, of attacks on women, of attacks on young people, of attacks on trans people. All those divisions are weaknesses that we can ill afford.
Believing that the present system of society is based upon the robbery of the working class, and that capitalist property cannot exist without the plundering of labour, I desire to see capitalism abolished, and a democratic system of public ownership erected in its stead. This democratic system, which is called socialism, will, I believe, come as a result of continuous increase of power of the working class. Only by this means can we secure the abolition of destitution and all the misery, crime and immorality which flow from that unnecessary evil.
Lorcan had actually brought up the paying conditions in the dock workers, so they had actually had lower hours, increased pay and conditions arising from union organisation. So there was the same demand coming from the transport workers, and Lorcan organised them.
Unfortunately for him, William Martin Murphy was the chair of the tramway. He's probably the richest Catholic businessman on this island.
I think Lorcan thought that there might have been a negotiated settlement, but there wasn't. And William Martin Murphy interpreted this as an opportunity to smash Lorcan. So we brought together a few hundred employers, and they all signed a covenant that they made the workers sign a covenant they would never join Lorcan's union.
So basically, a lot of them began secretly to join the Transport Union because they saw the wages and conditions that Lorcan was winning elsewhere in the city.
Some of the people involved in the formation of the Irish Nurses Union at the time were connected with Connolly and had, were in the same circles as Connolly. In fact, Maria Mortishet, who was one of who was the first General Secretary of the Nurses Union, her father had invited Connolly to come to Dublin to speak. And when you look back at the minutes of their meetings, when you look back at the democracy that they created around the union and the voice of the ordinary member, that resonates today. Our rule book is not massively different today. They set very good foundation stones for a democratic structure where the member had a say in how the union was run.
When you look at the countries that have the most productive economies, those are the countries that are the most equal in terms of wages and income equality. And those countries tend to be the countries that have very high levels of unionisation, where you have the right to have your union recognised and you have the right to engage in collective bargaining. In Ireland today, workers individually or collectively as a group don't have the right to be represented by a union. They have the right to be in a union, but they don't have the right to be represented by their union and to engage in the thing which unions do, which is to negotiate collectively for a better deal on wages and conditions in the workplace. But that right is denied, both individually and collectively, to workers in Ireland.
They had a meeting in Liberty Hall at which the workers gave an ultimatum. They said, look, he's sacking us. You said you were going to get us better pay and conditions, but we're losing our jobs. And they said, if you don't bring us out on strike, we're going to leave the union and we're going to tell everyone, you're a con man, basically. So he agreed then to bring them out. But But that's why it happened. And then they had a rally in O'Connell Street and then marched down here and had another one outside Liberty Hall. But within 40 minutes or so, Murphy had the trams running again. So at that stage, the only way of stopping them was to attack them. So that's when the rioting began. Larkin was arrested. Most of the other organisers in Dublin were arrested. And Connolly came down partly to replace them, to keep the strike going.
You know, it's interesting the way the lockout is presented to us in history as a sort of a precursor or a curtain raiser to the rising. It was an entirely different kind of event. It was the poorest of the poor attempting to defend each other. You know, when you look at the inner city of Dublin, from which a lot of the strikers came, the mortality rate was among the highest in Europe. And yet, they had it in themselves, inspired by Larkin, to rise and defend themselves to the extent that they could. But never forget, it was other Irishmen battered them off the streets.
The way they stopped the trams was quite simply by stoning them, by blocking them, walking in front of them, and then throwing things at them, you know, hard objects at the trams. So the police travelled on the trams. A lot of arrests, meetings were broken up, picket lines were assaulted. It was very vicious class war, basically. Come Bloody Sunday, what happened was Larkin, when he got out on bail, he announced that he was going to have a rally on Sunday. So on the day, he keeps his promise. Everyone was watching and waiting. The police lined O'Connell Street, literally shoulder to shoulder, both sides. He gets into the Imperial Hotel in disguise with a false beard and dressed as a businessman, running through the dining area out to where there was a balcony. He goes out on the balcony and he starts to address the crowd down below, who of course all begin to move towards the balcony to see who this strange man was. When the crowd surged forward, Sergeant Butler says that he told his men to move forward. So they drew their batons and they laid into them. And of course the crowd then turned and ran across the road, and on the opposite side of the road, what is but this other big mass of policemen who see this crowd charging towards them. So you've got this huge number of people trapped between two converging police lines, and they're literally beating people into the ground.
Countess Markovitz was there. She shouted 3 cheers for Jim Larkin, and a policeman smacked her in the face and another one ripped her blouse. And the police had been drinking and they went wild. They battered everybody up and down Sackville Street, as it was at the time. And in the whole weekend of violence, from Friday through to Sunday, 3 people were beaten to death by the police. So that set the tone for how this great lockout or strike was going to go. And of course, it also set the right conditions for Connolly and Larkin to found a workers' protection force, the Irish Citizen Army.
Larkin was up on charges. Really, there were only 2 people who could replace him. One was a man called P.T. Daly, and the other was Connolly. And the general feeling that Connolly should be the man to replace him. So it was a long, bitter winter. There was a lot of violence, but there was a hardening of attitudes. Some of the people who were quite prominent in the Citizen Army, for example, in 1916 and subsequently, were sort of blooded, if you like, by the lockout. That was their first experience of police violence, of state violence, and they learned how to retaliate.
That strike went on for about 6 months, right up to the end of 1913, and there was a trickle of settlements and people going back to work and so on. It petered out. It could have been looked upon as a complete defeat for the Labour movement. But Connolly wrote about this was a drawn battle, because he realised that the seed had now been sown for a more powerful trade union movement, even if they didn't win that particular dispute.
There is a page in history when the workers first fought back, when the might of exploitation at last began to crack. In farm and field and factory, in workshop, mine and mill, a flame was lit, a beacon bright, that flame it's burning still. Connolly was there. Connolly was there. Brave and undaunted, James Connolly was there. William Martin Murphy and his Dublin millionaires tried bribery and corruption, hypocrisy and prayers. To break the transport union, the scabs they did enlist. But all their graft was shattered by a scarlet iron fist. Connolly was there, James Connolly is there. Brave and undaunted, James Connolly is still there.
I think people feel really left behind. Like Ireland feels like it's a kind of an Ireland of kind of two halves, really. Like, you know what I mean? There's people that are doing really, really well, and there's people who have kind of fallen behind. A lot of it is a hangover from what happened in 2008 with the financial crash. We had huge amounts of unemployment. We had huge amounts of people losing their homes. My mother lost her home. Like, it's affected absolutely everybody, you know. And I think when we came through that, people thought it was for something, you know, like all of that sacrifice must have been for something. And when you see what's happening now in terms of the waste of public money, in terms of all of these scandals that keep happening and happening and happening in Ireland, I think people are just very, very frustrated at the state of things, and feeling that they don't have a voice, or they're not being represented, and they're going to kind of the quick fix, the kind of, you know, it's not, you know, the banker or the man in the suit that's done this. It's the person in the tracksuit, or the person like coming here from another country trying to build another life. They're the reason why you can't get ahead. I think it's really simplistic kind of narrative that is being put out there by people, but it's quite potent.
When people attack tents over by the canals with asylum seekers in it, you know, I know for a fact, and I've seen for a fact, that some of them are the same people who go after me because they want to feel like they're on the inside. And no matter how I dress myself up, or how I talk, or how I do anything, or how I present myself for any surgeries like that, like I'm still trans, and I love that. And so I will always be on the outside, and so I get to be with everyone else who's put on the outside too. Whether that is people who are seeking asylum, people who are experience racial injustice, people who experience so much ableism because of their disability. A lot of every single protest I go to, it is just full of the most diverse crowds.
The first painting I think I did of James Connolly was in 1971. I suppose you could call it a pop art portrait of Connolly. I mean, I started in the late 60s, and it wasn't just in Ireland, across the world. The 60s was a time of optimism, of youth, of change, all of that. I don't see that now. I'm not young anymore, so I'm not part of the youth culture. But I find there isn't that expectation of change, expectation of hope, which is disappointing, I think. There is a growth in the right in many countries. I mean, we've seen this before, and that ended up very badly.
When I think of all the false beginnings, the man was a pair of hands, the woman another pair, to be had more cheaply. The wind blew, the children were thirsty. When he passed by the factory door, he saw them. They were moving and then waiting, as many as the souls that crowded by Dante's boat that never settled in the water. What weight to ballast that ferry? They are there now, as many as the souls blown by the winds of their desire, the airs of love, not one of them weighing 1 ounce against the tornado that lifts the lids off houses, that spies where they crouch together inside until the wind sucks them out. It is only wind, but what braced muscle, what earthed foot can stand against it? What voice so loud as to be heard shouting, "Enough"?
Europe sleepwalked into the First World War. A lot of people saw it coming, but did nothing to stop it. And it was because of this mesmeric idea of the glory of warfare, which is always nonsense. War is butchery.
Incidentally, something I learned when I started off in the Union was that many of the people who were involved in the 1913 strike ended up in the trenches because they couldn't get their jobs back at the end of 1913. The employers wouldn't employ them. They had been actively involved in the Union. And the only place to turn was the British Army. And many of them ended up overseas and dying in the trenches.
The vast bulk of Irish men who fought in British uniform in the First World War had a stark choice: starve or soldier. Now, what are you going to do in a situation like that?
Like the proverbial bolt from the blue, war is upon us, and we are helpless. What then becomes of all our hopes, our resolutions, all our protest and fraternization, all our threats of general strikes, all our carefully built machinery of internationalism, all our hopes of the future? Well, they all sound in fury, signifying nothing.
This was the empires fighting each other, not for the good of ordinary people, but for the empires.
All these mountains of Irish dead, all these corpses mangled beyond recognition, all these arms, legs, eyes, fingers, toes, hands, all the shivering, putrefying bodies and portions of bodies, once warm, living, tender parts of Irish men, all those horrors buried in Flanders or the Gallipoli Peninsula. They're all the price Ireland pays for being part of the British Empire.
The issue for workers and the working class, I think, had to be seen through the prism of the whole idea of the Republic, Republican values, liberty, equality, fraternity. And right now, today, when we look at liberty and the attacks on rights and personal freedoms, that speaks to me about liberty. When we look at the scale of inequality we have now, yes, we're a wealthier world, but the level of inequality is so much deeper now than ever before. And when we look at fraternity and the concept of social solidarity, for me, and indeed in my daily work, the whole idea of proper social dialogue, of real social welfare and social protection, the importance of collective bargaining, and the need for quality public services, they all speak to the concepts of fraternity, social solidarity, equality, and liberty. And maybe there's a connection there between the turmoil of the world that Connolly lived in, the Great War, the downfall of so many imperial houses, and the scale of what we face now, and the uncertainty that exists. So it is very much a time for ideas, it's a time for hope, and I think that's the way forward now for the future.
Cart. He knew the strength in the neck under the swishing mane. He knew how to tell her to turn, to back, or stand. He knew where the wind hailed from. He studied its language. It blew in spite of him. He got tired waiting for the wind to change, as we are exhausted waiting for that change, for the voices to shout enough, for the hands that can swing the big lever and send the engine rolling away to the place we saw through the gap in the bone, where there was a painted room, music, and the young people dancing on the shore, and the old man of the sea had been sunk in the wide, calm sea.
The fundamentals of Connolly's view that the world had been stolen by the rich and powerful, and the people who controlled the economy, they also controlled the politics and the culture and the whole influence of society. That's still fundamentally true. It didn't change. But the world is different, and the context in which that has to be interpreted is different. And you look at the issue of modern society. But there's certainly the emergence now of billionaires, millionaires, and dictators, and imperialists, and the robbing of society, and the battles between the big empire builders. They're still there. And the treatment of the ordinary people in many societies, the poor die in all of these wars and all these disputes, and they're almost ignored. So the fundamentals haven't changed. And Connolly looked at the world from down below up rather than top down. Humanity has to try and regain the world from the dictators and the money makers and the profiteers. And it's that regaining of humanity, of their rights, so that they were dispossessed by the people with the power. And that struggle is still there.
Our idealism today is a mix of Pearse and Connolly together. They seem to have encountered each other a lot. I suppose once war broke out in Europe, that was the pivotal moment where they really came together. Eamon Ceannt was tasked with organising a meeting on the 9th of September in the Gaelic League Library on Parnell Square, and a decision was made to stage some sort of an uprising while the war went on. The real connection comes in January 1916. This is the moment where Connolly was sworn in to the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and they told him, we've got an uprising planned, and now Labour is going to be a part of the revolution.
Connolly, when he took over the Union, also took over the Citizen Army. And increasingly, as the rising grew nearer and nearer, his involvement in the Union declined.
We are out for Ireland for the Irish. But who are the Irish? Not the rack-renting, slum-owning landlord. Not the sweating, profit-grinding capitalist. Not the sleek, oily lawyer. Not the prostitute pressman. The hired liars of the enemy. Not these, but the Irish working class. The only secure foundation upon which a free nation can be reared.
I think Connolly saw an opportunity because of the Great War that 1916 really should happen during that period, as that was the opportunity when the empire was at its weakest.
The GPO column, they met outside Liberty Hall on Easter Monday morning, and it was Pearse, Connolly and Joe Plunkett who marched up towards the GPO.
When William O'Brien asked him, they were marching down Abbey Street on their way to the GPO, and William O'Brien said, "Where are we going, Jim?" And the answer was, "To be slaughtered." But he still walked on, still marched forward.
And Connolly shouted when he was inside, "Everybody out, we've declared a republic." We don't really see Pearse given that many orders. It seems to be Connolly who's running around. And of course, his secretary was with him, Winifred Carney, who came down from Belfast and famously charged into the post office with a Remington typewriter in one arm and a Webley revolver in the other arm. They barricaded themselves in, smashed all the windows and used huge books, you know, the leather-bound ledgers and journals, and packed them into the windows of the post office and sat there waiting for the British to come.
It wasn't long when they brought in troops from all over the country, right into the city, that they were able to surround the various bastions of the revolt and effectively lock them up, basically.
He took a shot on Thursday to his shoulder, his left shoulder, but he went back out again and he took a very nasty wound to the ankle and he crawled his way back in, lay in a bed, still giving orders.
Well, it ended after 6 days, and it was almost the best possible ending for all concerned. A, it was only 6 days. B, it never extended to the wider countryside as it was supposed to. Otherwise, it would have dragged on much longer. Fewer people were killed as a result. A lot of them died because of the artillery shells fired by the British Army in the middle of a city. Connolly, of course, famously said that the British wouldn't, because it was a capitalist government, it wasn't going to destroy capitalist property, but that turned out not to be the case.
Surrender orders, April 29th, 1916. I agree to these conditions for the men only under my own command in the Moore Street district and for the men in Stephen's Green command. We went out to break the connection between this country and the British Empire and to establish an Irish Republic. We believed that the call we then issued to the people of Ireland was a nobler call in a holier cause than any issued to them during this war, having any connection with the war. We succeeded in proving that Irish men are ready to die, endeavouring to win for Ireland those national rights which the British government has been asking them to die for, to win for Belgium. As long as that remains the case, the cause of Irish freedom is safe. The socialists will never understand why I am here. They will all forget that I am an Irishman.
They carried him all the way by stretcher to that Red Cross hospital in Dublin Castle. And Connolly was treated very well in Dublin Castle.
Nurse Lucinda McDermott, who was the last nurse to have seen James Connolly before he was taken from the castle. She was on night duty in the castle. And she wrote to my grandmother, "During the insurrection, I was on castle night duty in the officers' quarters of Dublin, and think I can claim to be the last person to hold your dear father's R.I.P. hand, saying goodbye to him, when the guard carried him down the back stairs to be executed. I may add that not only myself, but all the nurses were in tears. Also that I do not believe his life could have been saved, as he was suffering from a compound fracture and gangrene had set in, owing probably to the fact that he refused to leave his command in the post office for some time after receiving his wound. I was very young at the time, so all the events of that time made such a presence on my mind that they are still quite clear, and I would be delighted to tell you all when we meet. I can well imagine how you feel. Yours sincerely, Lucinda McDermott."
So I don't think he ever bowed to the fact that here he was facing the inevitable. 48 years of age, was still a young man. Obviously he would have liked to live. But I don't see any evidence of any wavering from what he set out to do and his belief that it had been a good life.
We were wakened up, it was about 1 o'clock at night. And the message that was given was that the prisoner, James Connolly, wanted to see his wife and eldest daughter. Anyway, we got ready and we went there. We were taken in an army lorry right through Dublin. It was an awfully queer, eerie trip. Still smelled burning, they still got that horrible smell of burning. And not a soul on the streets, because there was curfew, at that time. And we went up to the castle. So when we got into my father, he said, Well, Lilie, he said, I suppose you know what this means. I said, oh, no, oh, no, not that. He said, yes, Lilie. She broke down then and she said, but your beautiful life, James. She said, your beautiful life. And he said, wasn't it a full life, Lilie, and isn't this a good end? And she still cried, so he says, look, Lilie, please don't cry. He says, you'll unman me. So she tried to control herself. I was trying to control myself, too. Then they told us time was up and we'd have to go. He used to be shot at dawn, you see. That was the last I saw him.
The sea moves under the wind and shows nothing, not where to begin. But look for the moment just before the wave of change crashes and goes into reverse. Remember the daft beginnings of a fatal century and their sad endings, but let's not hold back our hand from the lever. Remember James Connolly, who put his hand to the work, who saw suddenly how his life would end and was content because men and women would succeed him, and his testament was there. He trusted them. It was not a bargain. In 1916, the printer locked the form. He set it in print. The scribes can't alter an iota. Then the reader comes, and it flowers again, like a painted room.
What I find fascinating about him is his huge, comprehensive, multifaceted personality and worldview. And, you know, when you read his works, for a guy who left school and enlisted in the British Army as a teenager, self-taught, this man is one of our finest public intellectuals in the trade union movement, and I think we as a movement need to reclaim him as that, so we have a more comprehensive, rounded view of James Connolly, the man, his work, his legacy, and his times, because it's not linear, it's not one-dimensional, nothing ever is. It's multifaceted, it's multidimensional. You know, there are bits we can all agree with, there are bits we can disagree with, but that's the wonder of history and taking the learnings from it and being inspired by it. And I hope it inspires another generation. And I would love in 10 years' time, if I was walking down the Shankill Road and I mentioned the name James Connolly, that someone wouldn't say, oh, he's a Provo. But they'd say, oh, yeah, that's that trade union leader who spent a bit of time up here and tried to unite Protestant and Catholic working class and left a rich legacy. I think that's what's more important.
What gives me hope is people doing stuff because they think it's right, and even if it's scary, even if they could risk their individual reputation, but doing so anyway because they believe it is good. I think that is unbelievably powerful. I think that is a power that is impossible to take away once you realize you have access to it.
Hasn't it been a full life, Lilie? And isn't this a good end?
Where is our James Connolly? Where is that gallant man? He's gone to organize the union, that all our workers, they might yet be free. Then who will lead the van? Then who will lead the van? Who but our James Connolly, the hero of the working clan? Well, they carried him up to the jail. They carried him up to the jail, and they shot him down on a bright May morning, and quickly laid him in his gore. Who mourns the death of this great man? Who mourns the death of this great man? Oh, bury me down in yon green garden, with union workers on every side. Well, they carried him down to yon green garden, with union workers on every side, and they swore they would form a mighty weapon, and that James Connolly's name could be filled with pride. Where, oh, where is our James Connolly? Where, oh, where is that gallant man? He's gone to organize the union, that all our workers, they might yet be free.